intro, or do I have to do it again?
Go for it, just whatever, just say.
Okay. Hi, I'm Peter Dirk, and we're here to talk about graphic novels today with full charged batteries. So, this is just a little history about my history with comics and graphic novels. Before we get anywhere, I'm probably going to end up using comics and graphic novels interchangeably because that's how they are in our library collection. We have a couple different things: comics, graphic novels, and trade paperbacks, and we'll kind of talk about the difference between all those. But here at the library, they're basically all lumped into graphic novels, so I'll try and use that when I can. So in 2002, I graduated high school, and like most people, took a senior trip. But instead of going to Mexico, I went to Comic-Con in Chicago, where I walked around and looked at comics and then got sick in the hotel lobby. So the first thing I want to talk about today is basically what is a comic, a graphic novel, and this book, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. If you've never read comics or you are a little into comics, but you've never really thought about comics, especially if you're asking the library question, are comics a genre or a format? I highly recommend this book. This discusses a lot of things about comics, about how they're made, what they can do, and especially what comics can do that other formats and genres cannot do. Because there are a lot of things, and the best examples of comics do things that you couldn't do in a different kind of book that's just text or even just pictures sometimes. All these, by the way, are checked out to one of our accounts. But after this today, if there are ones you want to take home, I encourage you to take them with you. You can just check them out on your way out and then read them at your leisure. So basically, his definition of comics comes down to sequential art. So it's art that has a purposeful sequence as you go through a page. That's about it. The only thing that his definition lacks is something that accounts for single panel comics like Family Circus, The Far Side. To him, those are not comics. But I say they are, so take that, Scott McCloud. Okay, this is going to be just a quick primer if you're not used to reading comics. And this is mostly for American comics, and Japanese comics are basically the opposite. So whenever you see a page, this is a full page. You start in the upper left, move to the right, to the left, to the right. So you kind of go across in a big Z the whole way down the page. It gets more complicated when you have more panels and when you have multiple dialogue balloons in a panel. So you go from the top there to the bottom of that panel, then to the next panel. So each panel exists almost as its own page, starting from the top and going left to right, and then you move on to the next panel. So you can see it gets kind of complicated. When you're looking at an open comic book, this is what you see. This white space is the crease or the fold. So you start here and you read this entire page and then move over. There are sometimes more complicated pages. For example, this is the crease in this page. So in this case, you start in the upper left and you move down the first page and then do the same thing on the second page, even though this is one big page or splash page, as we call it. Another comics trope that you'll become familiar with: squares or boxes are generally narration, or sometimes the character's inner thoughts. Dialogue balloons like this are things that people are saying out loud. And when you see a dialogue balloon but it's got a more cloudy shape, that's always something a character is thinking but not actually saying. Then you might have one like this that's also very complicated. This dotted line is the fold. And the way this one works, you go all the way across the top, then down and across the bottom half. So it's kind of tough. My best advice: don't get frustrated, take your time, do it nice and slow. There's an author, Mark Z. Daniel Lewinsky, who described reading his books more like climbing a mountain than walking on a treadmill. So some books you get on a treadmill and you just go where it takes you. Some books you have to get to the end, but you're going to have to figure out your own way to get there. Comics are a little bit like that. All right. Let's talk about universes. So comics are divided into universes, which are essentially the same as publishers with a little bit of difference. So this is DC Comics. So you've got, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash, etc. Lots of your famous characters. Then you've got the Marvel Universe: Captain America, X-Men, Iron Man, Hulk, all that kind of stuff. Then you've got other universes that are smaller publishers. Image, for example, started in the 90s and was one of the first big sort of independent publishers. Creator-owned is one of the big differences. So if you work for Image and you make something like Spawn or Invincible, you own it. Dark Horse, they do a little bit of everything. Hellboy is probably one of their most famous creator-owned properties. They also publish things like Star Wars and the Buffy tie-ins and that kind of stuff, so they're kind of all over the place. Oni Press, that's another press that'll just publish creator-owned stuff, and it's kind of a pretty big mixture. Scott Pilgrim is probably their most famous property right now. So these universes are why you usually don't see Batman fight Spider-Man or Captain America fight Wonder Woman. These are owned by different huge companies. Marvel is actually, if you go all the way up the chain, owned by Disney. DC is owned by AOL Time Warner. So that's why they don't do a whole lot of crossover. There is an occasional crossover, but it's pretty rare. Now, within these universes, you can also have sort of sub-universes. For example, Vertigo is a sub-universe of DC. The reason being, AOL Time Warner will say, we don't want you guys publishing comics where people get decapitated or, where people are smoking and drinking. We can't have Superman getting loaded in a bar. They don't want to do that. So what they say is, okay, we'll do this smaller imprint, Vertigo, where we can do kind of whatever we want. We have fewer rules. So the difference is, this is kind of the thing you see in DC Comics, and this is the kind of thing you see in Vertigo Comics. Now these characters, Hitman being Vertigo, Green Lantern being DC, can cross over. It's just not as common. Or you'll see things like someone exploding through someone else's body in a Vertigo comic versus more tame, I guess cartoony violence, more implied than explicit. All right, continuity, as Victoria asked about. This is the most complicated concept in comics. At any time, each character and each universe has its own continuity. So in theory, whatever's happening in Superman's universe is also happening in the same universe where Batman lives, Green Lantern, Flash, etc. But sometimes there's a big event, and that messes up the continuity. So for example, if Superman in his title decides, I'm not wearing a cape anymore, whoever's writing Batman, if they have Superman in there, they have to say, oh crap, we have to delete all these capes. So sometimes you'll go back through and something funky's going on. Also, you'll have weird stuff going on where in one monthly title, Invincible Iron Man, while we have this monthly title, The Ultimates, you have a completely different sort of Iron Man going on. He looks different, and the experiences that this Iron Man has are not the experiences that this Iron Man has. Little confusing, I know. So, here's the way I like to think about it. Normally, you would think about a character in a series as sort of a continuity like this, just a line. So you've got, the first incarnation of Iron Man all the way up to the present. But probably the better way to think about this is to think of sort of a central concept of Iron Man-ness. So you can recognize that's Iron Man, he's a guy inside of a suit, but branching out you've got sort of different versions. So you can have the movie Iron Man who's having different experiences from the Invincible Iron Man. The best way to keep track is to sort of start by picking one title and going with it. That's the best advice I can give you. Just start right off. All right, let's talk about some comics. So I tried to pick comics that I thought were good examples of the genre, but also comics that are sort of classics in the field. Ones that you could read if you haven't read very many comics that would give you an idea what we're talking about. So of course we start with Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. This is kind of the end of the golden age of comics and the entrance into the modern age. These are all stories by Alan Moore, who you would know as the writer of maybe Watchmen, V for Vendetta, and that kind of thing. He did a lot of superhero work early on. So it's kind of a different take on Superman and sort of a exit of a more innocent period of comics and society, I suppose, and brings us into a new era. And introduces a lot of characters you'd be familiar with. It shows interactions between Superman and a lot of the other characters. Lex Luthor, his arch nemesis, and so on. So if you've never read any superhero comics, that's a great place to start. If you have read some superhero comics, Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. This is a very important comic because in the late 80s, early 90s, comics made a big change right after this Superman book. Things got very dark. The anti-hero became much more popular than the hero. So instead of having a Batman who runs around in blue tights and fights with Robin, who we wish was wearing tights, but instead was wearing nothing, you have a lot of darker things. You have, in this book, it's the future. So Batman's a little older. Superman has become a puppet of the government, which they thought was the sort of inevitable conclusion of Superman. So Superman's essentially holding off the Cold War, and Batman decides to not let that happen anymore. So he comes out of retirement, and you find him in a very dark universe. Very dark things happen. It's a really interesting story. All right, Kingdom Come. This is another good thing to talk about in terms of continuity. So this is also a DC comic, has Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. And this is also in the far future. So all the heroes have aged quite a bit. A new sort of superhero has come out, much more violent than in the past. Instead of just putting the Joker in jail, they would just kill him. That sort of thing. So things have changed. Why I wanted to bring this out to talk about continuity is because this story exists. I'm holding it right here. But this is what we call an Elseworld story. So it's kind of like if you watch, what's the movie where the guy learns that he's a jerk and it's Christmas? You know what I'm talking about? This is a possible future, not for sure. It's a Wonderful Life, yeah. It's a jerk's life. This is what this is like. It's a possible future, but it's not necessarily the future. So it's kind of a speculative sort of story. It's also, if you look in there, has some really amazing art. It's done by an artist named Alex Ross. There's a couple more of his works in here, and he actually paints most of his art. All right, Green Arrow Year One. This is a fairly new book, and this is something they do a lot with the older superheroes. If you look back at older origin stories, they get a little stale. They don't necessarily make sense anymore because, if Batman comes out in the 40s and he's going to, like, a play with his parents, that doesn't really happen anymore. So they kind of try to update things. So it'll go from him going to a play with his parents, they'll tweak it so they went to the movies, stuff like that. This is an updated version of the Green Arrow. The Green Arrow was always an interesting character because he doesn't have any superpowers. He basically shoots a bow and arrow at people. But what makes him so different is he just basically lived in a normal sort of city, and he dealt with a lot of street crime, and they talked a lot about drugs. And Green Arrow and Green Lantern was the first sort of title where they dealt with this sort of issue of, hey, Green Lantern, you're off saving the universe all the time, but what about crack? Do you care about crack at all? And what makes Green Arrow really interesting is he actually has his own struggles with addiction and that kind of thing. So he's not perfect. He's a very human character. Okay, so human characters. This is also sort of a subtitle within the DC universe called Gotham Central. So this is a sort of related to Batman, but what this is a story about the cops who work in Gotham City. So what makes this so great is it's sort of like a cop procedural show, like a CSI or something like that, except occasionally, someone's partner gets frozen by Mr. Freeze or something like that. So it's very realistic, and it's very hard-edged, and they have this extra sort of thing to deal with, which is the classic Batman issue of, does Batman fight these criminals, or do these criminals create themselves to fight Batman?